Picture a cave in Morocco, maybe 120,000 years ago. Atlantic wind cutting in from the coast. A person anatomically identical to you kneels over the carcass of a jackal. They're not carving for meat. The cuts are too careful, too deliberate, all along the edges of the hide. They're peeling the skin off whole. Bone tools, shaped specifically for this job, lie nearby. More than 60 of them, found later at a site called Contrabandier's Cave. Whatever they were making, it wasn't dinner. You probably think this is a story about staying warm. Early humans, cold weather, animal skins, survival, obviously. But the real story is much stranger than that. Because if warmth was all we needed, we'd have found a different solution, or we'd have never lost our fur in the first place. The real question isn't why we wore clothes. It's why we became the only animal on Earth that felt compelled to keep wearing them long after the cold was gone. Here's the thing that stops most people cold: lice. Specifically, body lice. Scientists studying the DNA of human lice found something quietly extraordinary. The body louse, which lives exclusively in clothing and not on skin, split away from the head louse roughly 170,000 years ago. That date is not a guess. It's a molecular clock buried in parasite genetics. And what it tells us is that by 170,000 years ago, humans were wearing coverings consistently enough for long enough periods of time that an entirely new species of bug evolved to live in them. We didn't just throw a skin over our shoulders once. We kept doing it. We made it a habit. The lice are our timestamp. Now, why 170,000 years ago? Homo sapiens had already been roaming warm Africa for hundreds of thousands of years before that. What changed? The climate. This timeline lines up almost exactly with a brutal cold period, one of the harshest glacial phases our species ever faced. The African continent cooled, resources contracted. And crucially, the first tentative migrations north had begun into territories where being a naked ape wasn't just uncomfortable. It was a death sentence. Here's the irony buried in that. We had actually evolved to be naked. Over 1 million years ago, our ancestors shed their thick body hair to help manage heat while hunting on the open savanna. Long-distance running, midday pursuit of prey, sweating as a cooling mechanism, all of that required bare skin. We traded fur for speed and endurance. It worked brilliantly until it didn't. When the climate shifted and we pushed into colder latitudes, our greatest evolutionary adaptation became our biggest vulnerability. So we borrowed the fur of other animals. We became the only species in history to outsource its insulation. The first clothing wasn't fitted. Think loose, draped hides more blanket than garment. But around 40,000 to 50,000 years ago, something shifted again. Eyed needles appeared. Bone needles, slim and precise, with a hole punched through one end, found across Siberia and Central Asia. Researchers at the University of Sydney recently argued these weren't just survival tools. They were something new: instruments of tailoring. Suddenly, humans weren't just wrapping animal skin around themselves, they were constructing seams, fitted trousers, parkas that trapped body heat, clothing with shape and intention. This technology is why humans eventually colonized the Arctic. No other animal has done that. Not one. What came next is the part that rarely gets mentioned. Somewhere in those same decades, clothing quietly stopped being only about temperature. Ochre red pigment starts appearing on hides. Decorative stitching. Shells sewn into the edges of garments. We don't know the full context, but the pattern is hard to dismiss. People were making their clothes mean something. Not just protection identity. The same garment that kept you alive now told others who you were, what group you belonged to, what you'd earned. That shift from utility to signal is one of the most consequential behavioral leaps in our entire history, and it happened so quietly that most of us have never thought about it. Here's something that might sound wild, but it's taken seriously in anthropological circles. Dr. Ian Gilligan at the University of Sydney has proposed that the invention of the eyed needle, and with it, decorative tailored clothing, may have been driven partly by the suppression of body art. In warm climates, humans decorated themselves with ochre pigments, scarification, tattoos. It was how you marked identity on the body. But during the deep cold of the last ice age in Eurasia, people had to wear clothes all the time just to survive. You couldn't show your painted skin. You couldn't scar a limb no one would see. So the decoration migrated onto the clothing itself. The garment became the canvas. It's possible that fashion in the truest sense was born from a problem. You couldn't take your clothes off long enough to show your tattoos. Now, think about what clothing is today. Fast fashion. A $5 polyester shirt made to last 3 washes. A global industry generating over 90 million tons of textile waste per year. Logos as status. Seasonal drops engineered to trigger anxiety. The same impulse that once said, "This hide marks me as a member of my tribe," now says, "This logo marks me as someone who can afford this logo." The signal is the same. The intention has flipped. What began as shared identity within a community became differentiation from other people. What began as genuine craft bone awls, hand-stitched seams, hours of skilled labor became disposable volume. The meaning didn't disappear. It just got commodified until it was almost unrecognizable. The honest answer is that we don't fully know when clothing became psychological rather than physical. We don't know when the first person wore something, not because they were cold, but because of how it made them feel. We'll probably never find that artifact. Organic materials decay. Intentions leave no fossil record. We can track the needle. We can track the lice. We can read the cut marks on a jackal bone found in a Moroccan cave. But the moment clothing became about more than warmth, that moment is gone. We can only guess at it from the edges, from the ochre and the shells and the growing complexity of stitching. Right now, you're wearing something. Maybe you chose it deliberately this morning. Maybe you didn't think about it at all. But either way, you made a choice. And that choice, however small, however automatic, sits at the end of a 170,000-year chain of decisions made by people who were figuring out, one hide at a time, how to survive a world that wanted to kill them. The person in that Moroccan cave kneeling over a jackal, the seamstress in Siberia threading a bone needle by firelight, the kid in 1985 saving up for a pair of sneakers their friends had. They're all pulling the same thread. You are wearing the most ancient human invention there is. Not the wheel. Not fire. The second skin. The one we made for ourselves when nature stopped providing one. You don't have to subscribe, but you'll wish you had.